All right, let's dive right in. There's been a ton of heated talk lately about US-India trade, and it all seems to circle back to one thing: Russian oil. So today, we're going to unpack the accusations, check the facts, and see what the data really tells us is going on.
So, where did all this kick off? Well, back in early September, former President Trump dropped this exact phrase to describe the US India trade relationship. That's a really powerful statement, and it suggests there's a serious imbalance at play.
And it didn't stop there. Right around the same time, his aide, Peter Navarro, threw this even more provocative label out there, basically accusing India of being a financial laundromat for Russia. Now, these are some pretty serious charges, so let's get into the specifics.
Okay, so let's break down exactly what was claimed. Understanding the precise language here is going to be key to analyzing the facts that follow.
And wow, these claims really cover a lot of ground, don't they? They start with these big, sweeping economic criticisms, like calling trade one-sided, and then move to specific threats, like a massive 50% tariff. But they also get personal, with sharp accusations of oil laundering, and even remarks that were widely seen as invoking some old social stereotypes in India.
Let's tackle that first big one. Is the US-India trade relationship really a one-sided disaster? To figure that out, we've got to look at how that's even being measured.
And this is where you run into a big problem with that argument. I mean, think about it. When we talk about trade, we usually picture physical stuff, right? Things being shipped in boxes back and forth. But is that really the complete economic picture?
Yeah, the answer is a pretty clear no. See, that one-sided claim is misleading because it just leaves so much out. It totally ignores the massive amounts of money the U.S. earns from services, from intellectual property, and from sales made by its own companies operating inside India. Once you factor all that in, well, the relationship starts to look a whole lot more balanced. Okay, let's shift gears to that other major accusation, the really explosive one, about India being a laundromat for the Kremlin. Now, to fact-check this, you have to get into the nitty-gritty of the rules that were actually set up by the West in the first place. So, here's the crucial question we have to ask. India is undeniably buying a lot of discounted Russian crude. Nobody disputes that. But is it laundering? Well, the answer depends entirely on the framework that the G7 nations themselves created to handle this exact situation. And to get this, you really have to understand what the policy was designed to do. The goal was never a complete embargo on Russian oil, because that could have sent global energy prices through the roof. Instead, the West created this thing called a price cap. It's a system designed to limit Russia's profits while still keeping its oil on the market.
And this is how it's supposed to work. It's actually pretty clever. The G7 and its allies basically control the world's most important shipping, finance, and insurance services. They made a rule. You can use our services for Russian oil shipments, but only if the buyer can prove they bought the oil at or below the price cap. It cleverly shifts enforcement onto the service providers.
And this leads us to this central conclusion. When an Indian refiner buys below the cap and uses all the proper, compliant services, they aren't breaking the rules. They're operating inside the very system the U.S. and its partners designed. So calling it laundering just misses that crucial distinction. We've looked at the rules, now let's look at the numbers. To really understand India's role, we have to put its trade with Russia in a global context. Looking at the raw import totals for 2024, a clear picture emerges. China is by far the largest importer of Russian goods at nearly $130 billion. India is a significant number two, followed by the EU, which, despite massive cuts, still imported almost $39 billion worth. So, based on that chart, it's easy to see why headlines focus on China and India. But are these big, raw numbers the most accurate way to compare countries? The source material suggests there's a more insightful way to view the data. And here is that different perspective. When you divide a country's total imports by its population, you get a measure of economic exposure per person. And on this slide, the narrative completely changes. Just look at the top of the list. $515. On a per-person basis, that's Turkey's economic exposure to Russian goods. It's a staggering figure, more than 5 times higher than China's, and over 10 times higher than India's, completely reframing who has the tightest economic links. Ultimately, this per capita view provides essential context.
It shows that while India is a large buyer in absolute terms, its economic exposure per person is actually lower than China's and even the EU's. Singling out India without this context can be really misleading.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together. If the goal is to squeeze Russia's oil revenue, what's the most effective way to achieve it? Let's analyze the policy tools available.
And this slide lays out the options very clearly. On one side, you have broad tariffs, which the source calls a blunt instrument. A 50% tariff on Indian goods hits things like textiles and gems. It doesn't really touch the oil trade, which is governed by a separate set of rules. On the other side, you have sanctions, a precise tool that can target specific ships or companies that violate the oil price cap.
And this brings us to the final conclusion. If the real goal is to limit Russian oil revenue, a trade war over textiles and gems misses the point. The direct and effective tool is already in place: stronger enforcement of the G7 price cap, using targeted sanctions to punish anyone who violates it. And that brings us to our final provocative thought. If, as the evidence suggests, these broad tariffs aren't the right tool for the oil issue, it begs the question, what other strategic goal are they actually designed to achieve? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.